going to be fine for streaming. Yeah, it's live. Okay, hello. Welcome, Propenomix people, to another Sunday Supplement Live. And this week I couldn't get away from Angela Rayner, as you can imagine. I always like to start with a quote. And this week's quote is, "Let it work, for 'tis the sport to have the engineer hoist with his own petard, and shall go hard." And that's from Hamlet, if you recognise it, Act 3, Scene 4, Shakespeare, of course. And that is pertaining straight through to the deep dive. And what I'd say are genuinely seismic events this week in terms of Parliament and the resignation of the Housing Secretary and the Deputy Prime Minister, of course, as I said, Angela Rayner. But before we go in full hammer, Rod Turner and I will be running our next property business workshop on Wednesday, the 1st of October in London. The subject matter this time around is investment, with an emphasis on what metrics you really need to be considering to run your property business properly and building your business to scale. We're digging into the real fundamentals of property investment for growth, from proper valuation and strategic debt structuring to the investment metrics that serious pros use. Hint for you, you'll be ditching ROI and yield. Learn why some deals work for some and not others, how to manage risk as your portfolio scales, and when to shift gear from side hustle to scalable business. We're breaking bottlenecks, building strategic pillars, and unpacking real-life case studies of fast company growth. How have we done so many deals? Well, we'll tell you. Book the super early bird tickets with 20% off still of the face value at bit.ly/PBWEIGHT, and there's a link in the show notes. But anyway, I'm going to plough on first of all with Trumpwatch and what's going down stateside. So you might have heard of Trump's favoured pick for the Federal Reserve. It's a chap called Stephen Mirren, who's known as a Trump loyalist. He advanced through a Senate hearing this week and would fill the last 4 months of a term that's been left open by the resignation of a Georgetown professor who's returning to Georgetown last month. It's quite typical that highly academic, well-qualified economists are in the Federal Reserve, just like the Bank of England, of course. So nothing unusual there particularly. I think there's a few reasons why the lady resigned, which we can go into a little bit. But this is more about fear, really, because the fear is compromising of the Fed's independence. I've commented many times before that the government appoints the officials anyway. This happened in the UK when Jeremy Hunt appointed Claire Lombardelli to be the Deputy Governor of Monetary Policy. I did comment on that at the time and said some quite cynical things, but then there was a bit of a snap election, which prevented the Tories from actually being in power when she went into post anyway for very long. So the process is the same. The person carrying out the process is different, which is why we're watching very closely. Now, this week in the US had labour market figures which were weak, which led to a moderation in bond yields around the world on Friday afternoon. The expectations were to add 75,000 jobs, not many for the US, but remember it is August. But the real numbers added were 22,000 jobs, really small numbers for the United States. Whispers as well in headlines of various periodicals about a huge revision downwards for the year on jobs created. That also happened last year as well. So it seems like the ONS is not the only one under the microscope for revising data these days. And then the president also petitioned the Supreme Court to overturn a lower court's ruling that declared many of his emergency-based tariffs illegal. He talked of economic catastrophe if the tariffs were rescinded. Japanese automakers and the average $2,403 price increase per vehicle sold in the US were in the spotlight this week. That will, of course, make the used car market look much more attractive, naturally, just because that's how people's budgets and economics works. Now, approval ratings for Trump are falling, and the primary issue, which seems to be the best of them, is that ultimately the simple economic truths that have been stated early on, based on mathematical identities, have an annoying tendency of holding up. So we all know that you can't make a drug 1,000% cheaper. Depending on how much you like or dislike Trump will depend on whether you allow any poetic license or not. When you apply significant tariffs, pretending they won't put prices up is just silly, though. They will, right? The only question is by how much. Cost of living issues in polling are scoring an approval rating of 24%, which is dangerously low. And good old big, beautiful Bill isn't looking so beautiful the worse off you are, which admittedly was one of the things you expect from a Republican president. And I never predicted anything different from this administration. The difference here is just how many of his voter base are from lower tier income households, of course. But the macro data shows weak jobs, but look, 1 month, okay, but there is a bit of a trend here. Unemployment's growing. We're up to 4.3% now. Inflation is on the rise, which is impossible to divorce from the tariff situation. 38% of the public are polled as expressing confidence in Trump's economic leadership, even though consumer spending appears resilient and corporate investment remains strong. There was also a nice little din-dins this week with Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg and the likes, hosted by the president. And after the dinner, Meta and Apple both pledged $600 billion each in AI and tech investments. Eye-watering numbers. Of course, that could be a bit political. You'd expect tech companies to be investing in tech investments. So what does that even mean? But, that's serious dollar. And the clear message is that the administration is aligned strategically with the tech sector, running the winners as far as the Magnificent Seven are concerned. Again, like a lot of Trump things, it doesn't look like rocket science, but it does make some economic sense, as I've alluded to a few times, trying to stay neutral, of course. So back to the UK real-time property market. Chris Watkin delivered once more, week 34 in the can. Listings printed 29,100. That report was from the bank holiday week. And my 10% more stock than a normal market ready reckoner is still a bit there or thereabouts, really, because we've had a couple of years of overperformance in listing numbers compared to historical averages. 10.6% ahead of the 9-year average. I don't love the 9-year average because it includes 2020, which is an outlier. But then you could argue 2021 was therefore an outlier, 2022 was therefore an outlier, which would have some merit to it, really, that argument. So it does get difficult to interpret those figures. But the point is we're really coming back towards where we were in 2024 now, because at one point we were 6 to 7% ahead of 2024 in terms of listings. But now we're 2.7% ahead of the 24 listings and 7.2% more listings than before the pandemic. So still a few more, even though stamp duty burden is higher, interestingly enough. So we only had 17,500 price reductions in week 34. Remember, this was bank holiday week, so that takes a day out of the week. So you can't really compare these particular numbers week on week particularly well, but they compare okay in year-to-date numbers, of course. 14.1% reductions was August's official number. That was exactly the same as July's official percentage number as well. 14% in June. So we're seeing a very solid 1 in 7 at the moment being reduced. More stock, more reductions. So that's as a percentage and also in absolute number because we've got more houses on the market, as you can imagine. 33% more reductions than the 5-year average, right? There's at least 25% more reduced properties on the market at any one time than a normal market. Phrases like normal market, again, possibly not that helpful these days because what's normal? What's been normal over the last 5 years? Not a fat lot, really. But 1 in 7 being reduced. The run rate still looks about 90 to 95,000 price reductions a month. So I just think keep up the legwork if you can't find a deal. You don't see 14% plus of stock being reduced in strong markets every month by a stretch. Holidays slowed things a little. Sideways pricing continues. Now we're back in the term time swing after the August clear out. I'll be interested to see next week's figures. So 21,300 sold subject to contract. Bearing in mind the bank holiday, the average for the year is 26,200. But if you divided that by 5 days a week, you'd see it's roughly in line with all of that. And the SSTCs are still up, sold subject to contract, still up 6.1% year on year and 13% on the pre-pandemic market. Still nearly keeping pace with 2022. And I think it will finish more strongly than 2022 did. Obviously, because of the disturbance in 2022 from the autumn budget. If you're expecting as bad as that from Rachel Reeves, well, at least it's not till the end of November. But I can promise you it won't be as scary as what we've seen in 2022. I think this is a much more functional year, although we had the stamp duty cliff to deal with. And it also looks a bit more functional than 2024 because sold subjects are up 6.1. Listings are only up 2.7, as I said. So we're talking about more transactions or more transaction intentions than 12 months ago for this point in the year for sure, right? And also there was always a little bit of a wobble and a bit of uncertainty around the election to see what happened. Of course, I don't think that would have affected thousands and thousands of households, but I dare say it caused a few hundred to delay things, change their minds, things like that on a month-on-month basis. So remember, we had 763,178 homes on the market in August. As we went into August, we're still waiting on September's number. That should come to us next week, hopefully. It's a high amount of stock. Normal number, 660,000-ish, 650. That's roughly sort of where we were before the pandemic. So by that logic, we're more than 100,000 ahead of that. So we're more like 15% more stock than a normal market, if that's our benchmark for normal. As I say, sellers market is going to look more like under 600,000 homes on the market. So there's a big change that needs to happen there if we're going to go into a seller's market and we're really going to start ripping forward. We're at 716,000 at the end of July 2024. So that's a year before that other figure. So, 10% more than that, 8% more than that, something like that. We're still seeing higher highs. I don't know if we've seen that peak now. I don't like reading too much into what happens in August anyway, because of the school holidays. And I'm always loath about, month on month decisions. You don't normally want to be making knee-jerk reactions in property on the basis of 1 month's worth of data. Otherwise, you'd have a pretty tough time. Fewer than 1% more homes on the market than the month before. Let's see what's happened in the August clear out and how that manifests itself. We also are guaranteed to see a surge in listings when we see next week's numbers and the week after, because that's what happens at the beginning of September. School holidays over, back home, boom, let's get the house on the market. You see a ton of that, and you see the Rightmove asking prices lift significantly, which I'm sure we'll be analysing when the data is out on those, which will be the middle of next month, probably something like that. So the no hope stock will be cleared out, you would think, right? We also look at sold subject to contract price per square foot. It's a great proxy for what will hit the land reg. So we've had July's number just under £345 a foot. That will suggest maybe a couple of percent increase for the year, between 2 and 2.5%. Weak on my prediction of 3.75, below inflation, below wage rises and the likes. But it's very much sideways sort of stuff, with affordability just a little bit improving. But of course, if other things are inflating, taking more of a bite out of the pie, e.g. food, for example, if you pardon the pun, then that extra money that's filtering through is being stretched across a whole bunch of other categories. What about fall throughs? Well, they've trickled back below the long-term average of 24.2, back to 24.1. It's very tight at the moment around that. Basically, 1 in 4 falls through kind of stat. The net sales are still there or thereabouts, 16,200, 5% up on last year to date, 10% higher than 2017 to 19. Again, not quite 2022 levels, about 17,000 behind in net sales, which is not huge when you think we have 1.2 million transactions a year. Let's see where we get to, because I think the net sales almost certainly collapsed around October sort of time in 2022. So we're gonna see, because there were a huge amount of withdrawals. Remember, net sales is gross sales minus withdrawals, and the withdrawals went up to, there was a week where they were close to 50%, I believe, but they were certainly in the 40s for a few weeks around the mini budget, because the mortgage rates were just going up like an absolute rocket, aside from anything else. So I always give Chris this weekly shout out, and I'm grateful to him for his time always. I actually spoke to him earlier this week, and always enjoy those conversations. But he does some epic work on the stats front and the UK property market. And his core business is actually supporting people who want to grow their property-related businesses, normally estate agencies, because that's his bread and butter. But if you want to be a more effective communicator, if you want to be more in touch with your local market, then give Chris a shout. And also just drop him a like, a comment, a subscribe on his channel at Christopher Watkin. He's well worth it. For the value the man delivers for free is outrageous. So please do. And if you're listening to this and you aren't already a subscriber, then I would absolutely love you to subscribe to this channel. Drop me a like, drop me a comment. I normally can reply to those, although I'm not necessarily the fastest, but I do try to reply to all the comments, at least the ones that are constructive anyway. So what about, where are we going this week? To the macro catastrophe, as I've called it this week, because that's what it constantly gets painted as, isn't it, really? But when you step back, you actually see growth has been okay. I'm keen to point out that where growth has come from is the problem and the unsustainable part, but there's been poor progress on employment, we know that, and problematic inflation was just about under control. But it's not as bad as the press have been making out, which won't surprise anyone. We've had the nationwide house price index this week, Bank of England money and credit report, and the final August PMIs. Those three are stalwarts. We then have to look into the gilts and swaps, as you know, especially as things have been rocky on the longs, particularly over recent weeks, which again, far too much has been made up of when you look at the actual makeup of the debt. Although some of the questions that are being asked and what the markets are saying with the pricing that they're basically coming to at the moment, including what the Bank of England has been saying, they're absolutely the right questions to be asking, and asking the right questions of the Bank of England as well, which is important. Although I know it's not a lot of people's appetite and it's beyond a lot of people's scope of interest. It's very important stuff. So, nationwide house price index Well, the world ended once more, although it carried on, strangely enough, as another drop was announced. That colossal 0.1% drop. Last month, they printed plus 0.5% for context. But the nationwide annual figure is down to 2.1 from 2.4 in July. So again, that's sort of reinforcing that's our expectation for the year, because the land reg tends to lag the nationwide and Halifax figures by that sort of amount. But what did they have to say? Well, they had some interesting stats this month, which is unusual for nationwide for something that isn't the end of a quarter. Their chief economist talked of subdued house price growth and once again referenced high house prices with respect to household incomes. But I think the wrong data is generally looked at there, but that's a soapbox for another day. They mentioned their expectation that house price growth would continue to be outpaced by income growth, which would improve affordability gradually. They also point out the very obvious that rate cuts will lower mortgage rates, although I've been banging on about the 5-year rate has not moved a jot really in over 12 months now, but the 2-year has adjusted downwards and of course is more sensitive to the base rate than the 5-year, so it's kind of what you'd expect. Nationwide pointed to their recent research report on the housing stock in England, which they amusingly called Lock, Stock and New Solar Panels. Stock's up 9% in the past decade, up to 25.4 million homes. That's in England. Over half of them being classified as under-occupied, and energy efficiency has improved. There's perhaps a significant surprise here, really. Now, they look at 2013 to 2023, so bear that in mind. They've used the English Housing Survey as their data and done a bit of analysis. But total stock increased by 2.1 million dwellings, about 9%, and that was above the rate of population growth in England over the same period, which was around 7%. So get your head around that. And this report highlights 64% owner-occupier, which is not anything we didn't know, 19% privately rented, 16% socially rented, but flats are now 42% of the privately rented stock, up from 38%, and 45% of the socially rented stock. That being a proxy for 2023, when I say now, of course. But for owner-occupiers, flats are only 10% of stock. Imagine taking flat-dominated areas out of that. Areas of London, for example, when looking outside of the capital or at the M25, flats owned and lived in would be in the single-figure percentage. So owner-occupiers, only 10% of owner-occupiers are in a flat, compared to 40+% private rented. Quite a difference, which is news to me contextually. Intuitively, obviously, you'd expect that to be the case, but it's the scale of the difference that is interesting. And it speaks to, in my opinion, why capital growth in flats has been lower in recent years. It's also skewed by the Londons of the world, aside from anything else. But it tells you why flats often struggle on the open market. Owner-occupiers have clearly got a huge preference for freehold, I'd suggest, and they can afford it. And don't forget, the average owner-occupier household has an income of about 60k on the most recent numbers I saw, compared to about 35k for a household that's renting. And that huge divide in averages speaks as to why one, and when I say renting, I mean privately renting there, and that huge divide in averages speaks to why one owns and one does not. Unfortunately, much, much more than any of the other factors. There's just a huge growth in their actual income. Right, there's a huge difference between the two. What about floor area? Well, that's improved from 95.3 to 96.2 over the decade, so gone up a bit. Flats have got smaller by 1.7%. Terraced houses are up 3.6% in space terms, and semis up by 2.2. It's quite a lot, really, when you think about it on average, given that that covers most of the stock. So it just tells you how many extensions that have been done, aside from anything else. And there isn't much difference between the space in an average terrace, now nearly 92 square metres, and the average semi at 99 square metres. But look at it from the other way, the average owner-occupied property is 112 square metres, whereas the average for a private rental is 76, and the average for a social rental is 65. I talked last week about how social stock is shrinking in bedroom size when it comes to right to buy replacements, and so we'd expect that to be continuing to drop, aside from anything else. What about bedrooms, though? The important headline here is occupation. So under occupation is actually classified as having 2 or more spare bedrooms. And 53% of owner-occupier properties have 2 or more spare bedrooms. Now, I'm sure this is to do with the age of average owner-occupiers, I have no doubt. But 87% of owner-occupier properties have 1 or more spare bedroom. So only 1 in 8 owner-occupied houses use all of their bedrooms. And this 53% figure comes down to 16% in the private rental sector, and instead in the social sector, 8% are qualified as overcrowded, so more people than bedrooms based on standard definitions. This is things like children over 10 years of age of different genders sharing bedrooms. So basically, according to the rules that define the local housing allowance. What about EPCs, where you can see why the drum has banged as it does? 72% of social properties by 2023 were rated C or above. In the private rental sector, it's 48, but owner-occupiers were at 49. But we can't decry the process from 2013 to 2023. In 2013, only 23% of dwellings were C or above, whereas now it's over 50%, although you can see there it's only over 50 because the social sector has dragged it right forwards. 1.1% of dwellings use a heat pump as their main heat source, and this breaks back to 7.6% rurally and only 0.5% in urban areas. So more of a reflection of a restriction to gas access, really, apart from anything else. And now 6% of dwellings have got solar PV panels, with over 15% of properties built in the past 10 years having panels. 7% have got an electric vehicle charger, with 20% of the properties built in the past decade having a charger installed. So that was an interesting segue from the nationwide report this month, which was most welcome. And the only other part that caught the eye really was the 3-month on 3-month chart of pricing, which shows a drop of 0.4% in house prices. They don't make it clear whether they seasonally adjust that or not, but it does show a correction after the stamp cliff much more clearly, since there was a 3-month on 3-month climb rate at over 1.5% just before the time of the stamp duty change. Okay, how about the Bank of England Money and Credit Report? Remember, this is about July's activity because they lag a month on these reports. Net borrowing was up to 4.5 billion for the month on mortgages, a healthy month in the context of the past few years. And mortgage approvals, which is the number that always gets reported on, were at 65,400. Now, I benchmark a faster market at 70,000 plus. But 60k is functional, healthy enough. And 65k was actually the lower end of the normal between 2014 and 2019, which we would characterise as a pretty stable period in what's been going on. Mortgage lending is bumping along, increasing by 2.9% year on year, up from 2.8 in June. Remortgages decreased a little to 38,900, still much higher than it was a year or so ago. Net borrowing for consumers carried on at a roughly similar rate, 1.6 billion up from 1.5 billion in June. The growth rate is large, but the cutback in COVID was very significant, so perhaps still a bit of a lag. Although, however, 7 to 8% consumer credit expansion is not really a long-term sustainable number, of course. Large businesses are borrowing 8% more money than a year before, year on year. What about SMEs? Under 1% more, 0.9%. Although, hold on to your hats, that's the largest growth rate in SME lending since August 2021. So you can just see how small business has been quite so crippled by the pandemic, and then also ultimately the normalisation of interest rates. It shows you what the restrictive interest rates have done to the private sector side of the economy. And the money supply also underwent another healthy increase of 7.1 billion, which is down from June's large 11.4 billion, but very much in keeping with the inflationary environment we're in at the moment. And then the details that I like to draw out, the rate of debt on outstanding mortgages is 3.88%, and the rate on newly drawn mortgages is 4.28%. And the latter is down from 4.34%. So we're still seeing the gap still closed, but not closed yet. That crossover will be an interesting point in time, which still feels like it's going to be sometime around the end of 2026. But that does depend on rate movements, of course. If rates were to suddenly come down dramatically, aka there was a recession, then that crossover would come quicker, of course. Certainly not predicting that, by the way. Time deposits, so when you lock money away for a period of time, fell to 3.84% in July. So you see there's still about 0.5% difference between the time deposits and then, so people who are willing to lock away for 5 years, let's say, and the average mortgage rate. Instant access was at 1.89, down from 1.91, so pretty rough. Bigger businesses paying 5.8% on average for their debt. SMEs at 6.41. These are down 14 and 10 basis points respectively. Business deposits got 3.7 on time deposits and 2.25 on instant access. So business deposits doing better than individual deposits there, as you can see. Although I don't know where these business deposit accounts are necessarily coming from. There's only a few banks that seem to offer those, in my opinion. But there we go. That's what's been reported to the Bank of England. So there we go. Last of the triumvirate this week, the PMIs, where we had good flash numbers. How did the final numbers work out? Better than the flash numbers once again, which is great news. But we don't get a flash number for construction. So I'm going to start there this month because the construction index cratered last month and printed under 45. It printed 44.3. It's quite rare in the UK and notably bad outside of a clear time of crisis. The headline gives us a clue as usual. Sustained downturn in UK construction output reported in August. Well, you kind of feel like it might always be like that. The pace has slowed since July, but still printed 45.5, which is very clear contraction territory. That's going to drag on GDP for Q3 for sure. 8 months in a row of falling activity, solid reductions in new work and employment, and optimism at its lowest level since December 2022. And you know why they were so miserable back then. The longest continuous downturn since early 2020, the economics director tells us. A partial easing of the speed of decline was the most positive thing he could say. July's fall the fastest in over 5 years, not exactly a ringing endorsement. Commercial work was the one that was resilient at 47.8, residential 44.2, which has to go down as an ouch, and civils at 38.1, which is critical. Delivery time shortened, subby availability improved naturally, and price inflation hit a 10-month low on the bright side. All of this is pretty typical in times of lower activity, of course. Only 34% of the panel who were consulted expected a rise in output in the next 12 months, which is down from 37 in July. So it looks and feels now a bit like a construction recession. And from the PMI perspective, not the GDP perspective, those boxes would be already ticked with 8 months in a row below the 50 handle. Let's see when the GDP figures come out for Q3, how it did. Because from memory and Q1, the construction figures were actually positive. But the rest was better news in terms of the PMIs, sort of. Get the last of the bad news out of the way. Manufacturing contracted from the flash number, which is 47.3, to print 47, which is a 3-month low. Bit of a contraction of production volumes. Job losses registered for 10 months in a row. The sector outlook very uncertain. Everyone's scared of government policy, apparently. Understandable given recent form. The budget is now being cited as the next big thing, as I suspected it would be. Date now set 26th of November, which is apparently strategic, giving time for the gilt yields to calm down a bit. Although I do wonder, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, about if it's about the Treasury influencing the OBR over policy changes and how good they will be for growth. Because 0.1% in a year is worth such a lot of money over the forecast period. Services then, happily the big engine in the UK economy, had a much, much better time. A great headline, steepest upturn in service sector activity since April 2024. 53.6 on the flash numbers, up from 51.8 the month before, which isn't a terrible print anyway. And that actually became 54.2, a really healthy print that could carry both manufacturing and construction to a composite print of 53.5. Now the flash was 53 and the month before was 51.5. Output growth accelerated, a rebound in new order intakes, and business optimism at a 10-month high. The economics director at S&P described it as a welcome acceleration and a swift rebound. The new orders index saw the largest 1-month gain since March 2021. This is indicative of a decisive improvement in customer demand. Hiring trends, however, remain subdued, and a focus on automation and investments in productivity improvements have helped to alleviate pressure on margins. Make people more expensive, and companies will innovate and look elsewhere, exactly as you would expect, it seems. It ended, though, with continuing concerns over the budget. The composite index's 53.5 print is a 1-year high, but right on the river. Job shedding persisted. Hiring freezes are continuing. At the same time, firms are reporting spare capacity and pressure on margins due to rising payroll costs. Some people often bring up the point around AI here and whether ultimately this is something to do with AI and AI offering, various improvements and meaning people can be more productive without putting more money into it. Possibly is the case, realistically. They never really refer to it in the PMI. It obviously doesn't get mentioned enough in the report, but then you might deem that to be commercially sensitive data, although obviously the PMI is anonymised, so I'm not sure it necessarily would be. I guess it might be having a small impact at the moment rather than a large one, is what I would say. Okay. What about the gilts this week? Well, quite a week given how boring gilts normally are. But I've said this before, I like the boring weeks where the yields go down about 0.03%. It suits me if there was nothing to say here apart from reporting the numbers. But if you followed the headlines that emanate from the gilt markets, you wouldn't think that the yields were down this week, but they were. We opened at 4.127 on the 5-year and closed at 4.054. So forget my boring decay. We actually had a flamboyant decay this week of 0.073%. And the boring tale of the tape is that gilt yields are struggling worldwide. Most countries are struggling with their own debt piles post-COVID, too much government spending, and we're also heavily influenced by the USA, who are struggling with a huge deficit once you cut out all of the noise. The UK's got its own specific problems as well characterised in that OBR 50-year forecast paper, which I analysed a few months ago. Demographics and the age of population, the birth rate and lack of productivity growth, alongside the health of the population in general, which correlates to age, but is just well below its potential at this time. Too much spending for what it's generating, definitely. However, Friday's events, which were the weak job numbers being released as referred to in Trumpwatch, upped the probability of a US rate cut, which impacted our own yields by around 0.05 on Friday afternoon. Now, the 30s were the ones that actually made all the headlines, the long-term future hanging in the balance without a plan to control government spending or sort out long-term productivity issues. We opened the week at 5.619 on the 30s and climbed to yet another 27-year high of 5.756% yield in the early trading on Wednesday. Since then, the yield has relatively crashed back to 5.508, which still looks pretty high to me, but then I would qualify as a retail investor, not a professional when it comes to gilts, ultimately. But it's a pretty huge move without any particularly seismic long-term news that's specific to the UK. 25 basis points a year for 30 years. That's 7.5% difference without considering compounding of interest. So it's a really significant difference. But you can see, in spite of the headlines, it's an 11 basis point drop over the week. So therefore, the yield curve actually got a little bit shallower, which is what we want ultimately. And you could, if you were cynical, look at the budget announcement on Wednesday morning and question whether it was to calm the gilt markets or whether it just fueled that speculation and the bond vigilantes just kept selling gilts because that was around a 4-week or so delay to the expected budget date. Now, the only reason in the void is that the current sums don't add up and they need more time. And they won't add up without breaking the manifesto pledges again, which means another round of getting people on board potentially. But they maybe need more time to influence the OBR, as I was saying, about just how good their policies will be at promoting growth. That's the game, you see here. Persuade the OBR to put an extra 1% of growth in their forecast, trickled over 5 years, or even 1.5% extra. So you only have to add 0.2 here and 0.3 there. It doesn't sound huge. And that black hole that some have speculated at 50 billion plus just goes away, whether you think it's true or not. The average budget over the past 2 decades has seen an annual swing of 20 billion either way on available funds. Some might remember back to my commentary around Sunak and Hunt's budgets, where I regularly commented that the wind was behind them. Forecasts were very miserable coming out of COVID, whereas the more recent commentary around the OBR has been their forecasts are too bright. However, I was in the camp of under 1% GDP growth this year, and ultimately we're at 1% after 2 quarters, even though I would dispute what's actually caused that growth. But now we've got great service sector PMIs, so the private sector may come back and do its bit in the second half of the year. Let's not get too carried away, but we've got a couple of months of good prints now, and if we get a good September print, it really will be quite a good sign for the private sector side of the economy in services specifically. Doesn't mean that hospitality is not on its backside. Basically, anything that isn't paying too many staff at minimum wage is probably doing okay. It's a gross oversimplification, but you can see why I might say that, and you know the hospitality businesses are struggling. So we need to continue all that in reality, or Reeves certainly does, because when it comes to an end, the black hole expands ever further. We can't have the OBR suddenly getting realistic on their growth forecasts. We need them to continue overestimating things in order to continue playing the game. Again, it's not an unsustainable game. None of this ever appears to be a particularly sustainable game. They just lurch from one thing to another, hoping to get lucky somewhere, right? That game in gaining the 0.2% of GDP by the end of the forecast period and 0.4 within 10 years was in the planning changes that Labour scored. The OBR played ball with that. Apparently, it was about submitting to the OBR an explicit model with well-defined measures, we are told in parliamentary notes. So they must be asking if the same can be done for financial deregulation that Reeves has kicked off after asking regulators what they're going to do about growth. It's nice work if you can get it, because it finds money from thin air. The OBR is ultimately also bound by what people like the IMF and the OECD say. They can't be too far above these bodies, otherwise they lose credibility. Having said that, when the OBR releases their EFO, which is their Economic and Fiscal Outlook, that's on November the 26th as well, there will by definition be the most recent forecast in the big forecasting game, right? Both the OECD and the IMF will release an updated forecast as well before that date, but sort of mid-November, mid-October, that sort of time. The OECD were at 1.3 for UK growth 2025, and the IMF at 1.2 on the last stretch. So OBR were only at 1%, so that was the most bearish out of the three there, but there is a bit of room for that to go back up. But that was in March in the spring statement. That wasn't in the ultimate forecast for 2025, which was in 2024, where they were at 1.9%, which I guess at this point, it's not impossible that we hit that. I'd love it if we did. I just really still can't see it particularly. But who knows? With services doing well, we can always cross our fingers. So the current school of thought will be revisions back upwards, right? I think they'll come up to more like 1.5 for the year because they do tend to be more optimistic, but they won't be able to ignore the inflation rate and the unemployment rate and what that might mean in 2026. And you think it would be easy for the aforementioned organisations to make an accurate forecast. If you've got to publish it on the 26th of November for the year, you'd expect to be doing pretty well. It doesn't normally work out like that, strangely enough. Perhaps there's a third reason for budget timing in there, though. The first quarterly estimate for Q3's GDP will be due on the 13th of November from the ONS. And the PMIs were finalised Wednesday morning at 9:30 a.m, just before the budget announcement. So I'm putting two and two together there. But ultimately, if you saw some pretty good PMIs and thought, right, okay, July's has been pretty good, August have been great, if September's are good, then we should really be looking at something pretty special for Q3, hopefully for growth. And if that comes out as well, the OBR will be under pressure to revise their growth forecast upward again. And I don't doubt there's a lot of clever people around Rachel Reeves who are not particularly political, civil servants working in the Treasury, etc., who understand all these things pretty well. And if everybody's pointing in the same direction, unlike a Liz Truss style fairly maverick sort of approach, and they're willing to play the game within the rules that they've set, then this is exactly how I would be looking at playing the game. So there might be some cleverness here that we're not giving enough credit to at the moment. And of course, expectations are set in a rather low way for this budget, not because Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have come out and said, here comes the axe man, as they did in 2024, but because everyone's speculating themselves. So perhaps when it comes out and it's not as bad as expected, and I don't think there's many commentators predicting that, but I do think I can say that with some confidence, solely because some of the predictions are so miserable, right? I do think I can say that with some confidence. And if that does happen, we might see a bit of positivity for 2026. But you're still going to be looking at an unemployment struggle and a trend going the wrong way. That really needs to be snapped off. And you're also looking at an inflation situation where at the time, when we see September's number announced, which will be sort of mid-October sort of time, perhaps that's another good reason to delay the budget because it might come down in October's number that's published in November. Perhaps they're hoping that they see a peak to sort of 4.1 maybe for September's number and then back into the threes for October. It's pretty hopeful, but you've got to get hope from somewhere, haven't you? Otherwise, you don't have anything. So it's possible that it could play out that way. So that was a bit of a segue from the gilts, but it was on the gilt subject, of course, but not exactly a deep dive. I was going to do a deep dive on that subject for the week, but obviously I just could not let the resignation of Rayner go without significant commentary. So she wins the deep dive this week by losing, and off we go. So firstly, I feel a bit pre-contracted to release the actual truth, which has concerned an alarmingly small amount of commentators. I'm absolutely sick to death of people who are purported experts in this, that and the other, getting the facts of this case wrong. The facts are, the stamp duty rules are clear here. I've said many times before, stamp is not overly complex. Let's be fair, this case in itself is complex, much more so than an average person involved in a transaction, because a trust is involved, which is normally critiqued, particularly by the left, as a preserve of the rich, of course. However, the interest in the trust and the beneficiary being a minor, regardless of anything else, makes it clear that additional home stamp duty is due in this case. So how about it's an honest mistake, Gov defence? Now, I actually believe that probably is the case here, but the real mistake here is that when you're the Deputy Prime Minister, let alone someone who has spent many hours criticising MPs from the other side for tax avoidance, you pay for specialist tax advice when you're paying a massive chunk one way or another. You get a barrister or similar to advise you. You're not going to be held to the same standards as a member of the public, and you've volunteered for that, right? And you're very outspoken about it generally. So that then leads to a mistake on the stamp duty return, and that's where we've got to. Now, I think that's pretty much what the ethics advisor has also confirmed in terms of acting with integrity. He's not there to comment on naivety and things like that, but he was there to comment on whether the ministerial code has been breached, which he ultimately ruled that it was, and that led to Rayner having to remove herself from her post or risk being completely, I say one thing and do another, which was never an option. And I don't think she would have considered it as an option, really, taking her at face value. But I reflected this week, this is what people like me care about, right? The truth and the technical detail. It's a typical nerd-style response. On the real world side of things, I was sent several memes and AI videos, including a rap one, which captured much more cleverly what the supporter base, some who are probably now former supporters of Rayner, were actually thinking. She's got more than one house. She, at the time, had her grace and favour ministerial Westminster residence, then now a posh flat in Hove, and then this Ashton residence. How many houses can Rayner buy? Chanted the video. Reading social media commentary from what looked like genuine public accounts, this was the line that took off. I'm sure some supporters will claim it was started by Russian bots or the right-wing media. It's very difficult to establish the veracity of that, which is exactly why people throw mud generally, of course. But it does make sense. The one self-styled, big-profile Labour politician as one of their own with an £800,000 house that's also not in her constituency, nor is it in London. Well, it's out with the wildest dreams of the vast majority of her supporter base, I'd suggest. But this is a reminder about perception being reality. Even after the event, many so-called experts being asked to comment are still getting the facts wrong. How have the centre-left commentators responded to this? Some speculation as to when Ange might be back, hence why I've used the image I've used this week. I'd suggest she'll be back, all right? It isn't without precedent on either side, back when there were only two sides to the equation, even if it looks like we're seeing the complete breakdown of the two-party system at this point. Peter Mandelson came to mind immediately, back from the Blair government, and is, of course, still around, actually, envoy to the United States, right? He took 10 months on the sidelines back in the 90s when he then was brought back. Milburn and Blunkett, you might remember, were probably the other high-profile ones from the Blair era. Michael Gove, Amber Rudd, Sajid Javid, over the past 10 years, were also people who went onto the backbenches for a while after being a minister and then returned to other posts, some with real significance like Michael Gove, and of course Sajid Javid went back to be the Chancellor apart from anything else. So not all of them left because of a ministerial code breach, of course, but again, I don't think there's too many that really care about the detail of that. It just trigger another replay of all those videos of Starmer saying, we will do the right thing, etc., his version of drain the swamp or whatever, and be more fuel to those who believe in the two buttocks of the same behind argument. But it just depends how you see Rayner as fitting into the setup going forward. My initial analysis was that Starmer hasn't had a bad week at all. Rayner was far and away his biggest pressure point from a personal perspective in the current setup. She was incredibly popular and the nailed-on favourite to be the next Labour leader, with only Andy Burnham polling anywhere near as well as her. And he would need to want to do it and win a by-election, first of all, of course, unless he was going to go through the Lords route, but that would be very unusual. And it would also need people like Starmer to be on board. But Wes Streeting is now in that box seat instead. It's also very much rumoured that Sir Keir didn't like Ange very much. But it's not only Starmer who's had a good week on that basis then. Rayner was by far the wildest card had she been elected party leader. It's very difficult to say just how much the ship might have lurched to the left under Ange's leadership had it happened, although many choose not to follow this logic. The current iteration of Labour is very central at the top level, right? It's not particularly to the left. The parliamentarians are not, which is why they destroyed the ambitions of the welfare cuts. Streeting would, if anything, move the ship further to the right. Uncertainty is exactly what investors don't like for a reason, remember? So, what for housing and government policy in general? Again, the analysis on this seems to be rather light. You can read the articles that have just been overjoyed at the downfall of Rayner. Personally, I wouldn't waste any emotional energy on that. The facts around her now struggling with that mortgage and the likes don't give me any satisfaction. She's had a pay cut of 67.5 grand a year. I know she's still on 94 grand. So there's no violins on any side for that. But I'd guess a mortgage of over 3 grand a month and 3 kids to think about. Although they are largely grown up. Well, obviously, there's one who is disabled, which is why the house in Ashton has been put into a trust. But is this the excuse that was needed for missing the 1.5 million homes target? Well, I'm not so sure, because the new Housing Secretary, Steve Reed, has moved over from Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He was for 6 years the leader of Lambeth Council, which you'd think would give him a London-focused but real-world view of housing, apart from anything else. Now, I'd suggest this is a huge job, right? When the new government, when they were new, published their 40 major bills in the King's Speech, which I analysed at the time, and the housing side was significant, but the devolution side, which I haven't touched on a lot, was also hugely ambitious. Well, this is where it gets interesting as far as I see it from outside of the fence. The left, and those who lean left within the civil service, we're often led to believe is the majority, know that the centralised system of government has become more centralised since Thatcher. It's too centralised, and their arguments on that front are pretty coherent, actually, when you read them. There's so much power in the Treasury when it comes to actually deciding whether things get done, and there's too much short-term planning of things rather than long-term planning of things. This is what all the pretty sensible, centralised political commentators who would not necessarily have any party allegiances will tell you, right? So they worry about day-to-day local matters. I'm talking about the people who actually pay council tax now. They worry about day-to-day matters like potholes, as you know, right? Which is why it's pretty smart to concentrate on those issues if you want to win votes at the local level, even though the vast majority of budgets are spent on children's services and social care and housing. And they're all statutory duties, right? They're duties that have to be fulfilled in law. And nobody really has that conversation. There's 75 to 80% of the council's budget you can't do too much about. Of course, you can scrutinise those budgets and how they're delivered. And I believe that Reform are doing some of that. Some of that has been in the media. But generally speaking, you've still got to fulfil the broader obligation. And Reform is clearly leading the way with their messaging on things like that. So what's the overall plan then when it comes to this devolution scenario? Well, there was a white paper, 16th of December last year, Power and Partnership, Foundations for Growth, typical sort of title. And I think if you look at the wider media around this sort of stuff, I pay an interest to it. About combined authorities and things like that. It may well be affecting where you live. There's also a designation of strategic authorities in there and the talk of structural reforms. This then became a bill which was actually introduced just before the summer break this year. It's called the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill, 10th of July 2025, which was actually introduced by Ange, of course. This is basically giving mayors more power, more responsibility, as you might expect. And the second reading has already taken place this week in Parliament on Tuesday, the 2nd of September. And further stages are pending. So next up, two-tier councils, and yes, that's not me being flippant, that's really what they're called, have been asked to propose unitary authority structures by late 2025. Simply put, two becoming one there. So you would expect that to make things simpler and be aligned with devolution, removing bureaucratic layers. What made some of the headlines again that we might be more familiar with? Well, new mayors, with the best publicised, I think, being Andrea Jenkins at the moment, who was noisy this week because of her Insomniac rendition as she took to the stage at the Reform conference. Now, it wasn't necessarily my taste in music, but again, you have to admit these things are quite clever because they grab headlines. I must have seen that clip 3 or 4 times, and I'm not deliberately necessarily going out searching for this stuff, nor am I necessarily affiliated with any political party. I watch them all on social media and try and interact with them all on a relatively even basis. But Reform have got the media, and that was probably the most memorable clip of the week. Let me know if you disagree with that in the comments. So the bits that I saw from this, it made it look like an anglicised version of the RNC, the Republican National Conference, which I can only assume is pretty deliberate since the reps have ultimately won 2 out of the last 3 elections in the US. And I think it's pretty fair to say the world has changed without getting too far into that and the implications. You might remember back when Trump won and around the time of Brexit, Cambridge Analytica were taking a lot of heat for causing that whole situation. That's changed and not changed. I suppose Elon Musk taking over Twitter, Russian bots, all that chat about that sort of stuff. But it seems that most of the stuff that's going on socials looks pretty genuine around Reform because you've got an absolute boatload of people very willing to come out and pin their colours to the mast of all ages, genders, and all the rest of it. So seems again from the outside there's widespread support for devolution, but it's a massive task. I still wonder whether Ange might still be consulted here as to her vision for it, or whether she was just taking the advice from the civil servants on this one and it will go ahead largely as planned. But the sharper eyes will surely see a problem here. And that problem is nothing to do with Ange or no Ange, but a completely different matter that I've accidentally on purpose been referring to in that analysis. Well, what's that? Well, when the King's Speech 2024 was released with all these bills, the world looked different. Reform was polling in the teens, just where Fruit and Nut or Jez Ballar are currently polling, whichever name for for that party you prefer. It was just the annoyance that Farage had always been at the time. Then they dominated the council elections in 2025 in the largest council election shockwave for generations. And I get the feeling there's also been a bit of a network effect here. Oh, actually, if a third of the people, roughly in the polls, that's what they're polling at, think it's okay to vote for reform, maybe it is okay. Maybe I need to look a bit more closely. Maybe I don't need to be so worried by labels that get put on people who might show any sort of interest in the Reform Party. So there's definitely it's okay. Well, next door neighbour's doing it, or I'm seeing flags in the gardens in places, out on the street, on the ground when I've been out looking at properties. That's what I've been seeing. I've been seeing reform posts in the front gardens. I haven't seen anything else, to be honest with you. Does that speak to the area in which I'm buying houses? Well, again, probably fits the profile of the Trump demographic in the lower income deciles that are that have supported Trump and the Republican Party in recent years, right? But part of the issue with all of this is that the puffery used in the media day in, day out, the 24/7 media, means that when something genuinely significant happens, it's actually quite hard in your brain to pass that from pretty normal stuff that's going on, right? So make no mistake, the council election results in 2025 were truly seismic, and the reform quake was most certainly a thing in terms of the data and in terms of the significance. The great leader, or whatever we might have to get used to calling him, referred this week to over 100 polls in a row that have had reform at the top. So you have reform mayors, you have reform-led councils. Anybody local to me will know of the 19-year-old leader of Warwickshire Council at this time, George Finch, I'm sure. And reform at this time, an absolute shoe-in to gain a load more council seats in 2026. And of course, what about Wales coming up by, I think it's June or July. I think it's May, sorry. Has to be done by the 7th of May, I believe, the Welsh election next year. But are you seeing the conflict now, right? There's a huge technical and bureaucratic reason to devolve more power to the local authorities. But Reform are already in charge of some and likely to be in charge of many, many more before the next general election. So Labour effectively ends up handing more power to Reform in the spirit of doing the right thing as far as the civil service sees it. I'd suggest this might cool the devolution agenda significantly, because when all this was put together, the landscape was very different. Once we get to voting in the Commons and the implications of what I've said here are put into party political language, do you see the bill then getting dramatic support? Do you see it doing what it was set out and intended to do, even if it is the best thing for the country from a functional perspective, and even if it is a more democratic, emphasis or a more democratic manifestation, I suppose, of the system? You can see and you can hear, I'm sure, that I've got my doubts here. Okay, what about the 1.5 million homes insane claim? Is it in this reshuffle, which obviously is inspired by Angie's departure and has inevitably been brought forward, probably brought forward from next year, to be honest? Is it time to drop this claim because it's impossible and because we're very close to a construction recession if we're not already in one, as I've described above, with house building printing sub 45 in the PMIs? Well, probably only one more relevant thing to consider then: renters' rights. Is the bill going to change at all given all this? Well, it's too late in the day, isn't it? The next game of ping pong is tomorrow, and royal assent is expected this month, with it coming into force in early 2026. I think Mr. Reid will have to run with the football on that one. There's not been anything to suggest he will feel strongly enough to change anything at this stage. It looks like continuity and implementation, the latter of which he seems to have a pretty solid track record on, if we're to believe what we're told, if we should ever do that. So I'll leave you with one thought, really, as I bring this one to the close, and point you to this week's image. Angie's down, but not out, in my view, even though this might be the highest profile knock she's ever taken. She'll be back, in my view, but not necessarily as leader. Now, before I do close, please don't forget to book your super early bird tickets to the next property business workshop that Rod and I are running on Wednesday, 1st of October in central London. This time around, investment metrics and how to run your property business at scale, which is my favourite topic of all. Book at bit.ly/PBWEIGHT. And please remember to keep calm, always listen to or read the supplement and carry on. There will be opportunities abound this year and towards 2030 and beyond. The landscape has been set for a surefire bull run. It will be slowish and take a little while things take longer to get off the ground. And the amount of stock around is improving things and still keeping things a bit suppressed at the moment. But yields, as they currently continue to improve on property investments, it's going to be a case of here we go, in my opinion. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great day.